The night was quiet, almost too quiet, when Sophia Carter disappeared. Her last phone call was filled with panic, her voice trembling as she whispered into the receiver, "I don't know what he's capable of." But no one knew just how far her husband Mark would go to protect the dark secret he had buried for years. For months, the marriage had seemed normal, perhaps even idyllic. But behind closed doors, something sinister was brewing. A dangerous truth only Sophia had uncovered. She had threatened to expose it all until she vanished without a trace. The investigation seemed straightforward at first, but as the days passed, something felt off. Mark played the grieving husband, his calm demeanor hiding something darker. It wasn't until a week later that the real horror began to unfold, when Sophia's family sat down for what they thought was a normal dinner. But in that meal, they unknowingly consumed something far more horrifying than they could ever imagine, something that would haunt them forever. How could a family eat their own flesh and blood without even knowing it? What twisted turn led to this unimaginable act? The truth would be far more shocking than anyone could have predicted. The question remains, how did it all come to this? What could have driven a man to commit such an unthinkable betrayal? Let's go back to where it all began. Sophia Carter was a woman who commanded respect in every room she entered. A marketing director for one of the most prestigious firms in the city, she had built her career from the ground up, earning a reputation for her sharp mind and unwavering commitment. But it wasn't just her professional life that set her apart. It was her devotion to her family that truly defined her. Sophia was the rock of her household, balancing the demands of a high-powered career while raising 2 young children with her husband Mark. Their home was warm and welcoming, the center of countless gatherings with friends and extended family. Sophia was the embodiment of a woman who had it all: success, love, and a future that seemed as bright as her smile. Mark, her husband, appeared to be the perfect match. A successful lawyer with a calm, composed demeanor, Mark had the charm that made him likable to everyone he met. His colleagues respected him, his friends admired him, and to outsiders, he seemed to be the loving, supportive husband everyone hoped for. They had been married for over a decade, a union marked by shared goals and mutual respect. Their relationship was the kind that others envied, outwardly perfect in every way. But as their marriage wore on, subtle cracks began to appear in the veneer of perfection. Sophia noticed the small things at first: Mark's increasing distance, the long hours at work, the sudden need for secrecy when it came to his finances. It wasn't anything overt, just a growing sense that something was amiss. He would leave his phone face down, his email inbox would be filled with unfamiliar names, and he was more defensive when she asked about his day. At first, she dismissed it as stress, work pressures, or just the normal strains of married life. But then, one night, something happened that forced Sophia to take a closer look. Sophia's instincts had always been sharp. She trusted people, but she never ignored her gut feelings. So when she began to notice discrepancies in their bank statements and credit card charges, she couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that something was wrong. After some quiet digging, she uncovered something that shattered her sense of security. Mark had been involved in fraudulent activities. Her husband, the man she had trusted with her life, was hiding a criminal past she could never have imagined. The evidence was damning. Transactions linked to shell companies, unexplained large deposits into accounts he hadn't mentioned, and a series of dubious financial moves that screamed embezzlement. It was a complex web of deceit, and the deeper Sophia dug, the more disturbing the discovery became. Mark had been siphoning money from his clients for years, using his legal expertise to cover his tracks. But there was more, something even darker beneath the surface. The more Sophia learned, the more frightened she became. She began to feel a creeping fear every time she saw him, every time he walked through the door. She didn't know exactly what he was capable of, but she knew she couldn't keep quiet. She had to tell someone. She had to expose the truth. So, one night, as she sat with a close friend over a glass of wine, she finally spoke out. "I've found something. Something I can't ignore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mark, he's been hiding something big. And if I don't do something soon, I think it's going to get worse." Her friend, initially concerned, urged her to tread carefully, but Sophia was determined. "I'm going to expose it all," she said, her voice trembling with both fear and resolve. "I have to. I can't live with this knowledge any longer." Sophia's decision to speak out wasn't an easy one. She knew it would tear their family apart. She was terrified of what Mark might do, of how he might react. But in the pit of her stomach, she could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her. She couldn't stay silent. But the next morning, as she sat at her desk, something felt off. Her phone buzzed. It was a text message from Mark, his first of the day. And it was unusual. "I'm not sure if I can keep this going," it read. "I'm sorry." Sophia's heart raced as she read the message. What did this mean? Had Mark finally cracked? Or was this just another manipulation to keep her quiet? And then, as the hours went by, she received another message from a close friend, one that sent a chill down her spine. "Be careful, Sophia. You don't know what he's capable of." Sophia's fingers trembled as she typed a quick response to her friend, trying to brush it off. "I'll be fine," she wrote, though in her heart, she knew it was a lie. She didn't know that this would be the last time anyone would hear from her. The next few hours blurred into a chaotic blur of unanswered phone calls, texts that went unread, and a growing sense of dread in the pit of her stomach. Her family noticed she was missing, but no one suspected the horror that would unfold. Sophia thought the worst thing that could happen was a divorce, but she had no idea what Mark was capable of. It was late on a Thursday evening, October 18th, when everything changed. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of fall night that seemed ordinary at first, until you looked closer. The Carter family home, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, stood silent under the glow of a single street lamp. Inside, the house was just as still, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the quiet murmur of the television. But something was off that night. Sophia Carter had gone out earlier in the day to meet friends, an evening away from the stress of work and family life. She had promised Mark she'd be home by 9:30 p.m., but by the time she returned, it was nearly 10. The CCTV footage of her entry into the house captured her face, illuminated by the dim porch light. Sophia's tired expression contrasted with the normalcy of the moment, the typical rhythm of someone coming home after a long day. She stepped through the door, looking as if she was ready to relax after what seemed to be a pleasant night out. But what followed was anything but normal. Her final moments inside the house were quiet at first. No more than 5 minutes passed between the time she walked in and the first signs of tension. Mark was already home, and as usual, he greeted her with the same polite, calm demeanor. But that night, something had shifted between them. An invisible line had been crossed, and it was clear that the evening would not end as anyone could have anticipated. Sophia's phone buzzed at 10:15 p.m., a text from her friend, a simple check-in. "Everything okay? You've been quiet." No response, no follow-up messages. A typical sign for anyone who knew her. Something was wrong. Her absence online wasn't like her, and her lack of communication only deepened the unease. It wasn't until later that night that neighbors began to hear something unsettling, raised voices. At first, it was muffled, a typical domestic disagreement between a married couple. But as the volume rose, it became clear this was not a small argument. This was something more intense. The neighbors who lived a few houses down testified to hearing the shouting, the slamming of doors, and the unmistakable sound of items being thrown. It was the words that pierced the silence next. "I'm going public with this, Mark. I've had enough." "The truth is coming out," Sophia shouted, her voice thick with emotion but firm with resolve. "I'll make sure you regret it." Mark's voice followed, colder now, no longer attempting to hide the fury that had been building. They heard the silence that followed, the kind of silence that fills a room after everything that can be said has been said. The tension thickened in the air, and a moment later, a neighbor heard a thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving quickly across the house. But no more shouting came after that. The eerie quiet that followed marked the final moments of Sophia's life. What was said in those final moments will never fully be known, but neighbors who heard the fight suggested that it was not just about Mark's deceit, it was about something darker, something far more sinister. As Sophia's voice grew louder, demanding answers, her resolve grew stronger. The truth had already started to unravel for Mark. Her discovery of his financial crimes, his lies, and his secret life. And that night, she finally declared she would expose it all. The neighbors spoke later of how the shouting stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. It wasn't the typical end to an argument. In a marriage where tension was often swept under the rug, this confrontation felt final. At approximately 10:45 p.m., Mark Carter's wife, Sophia, was dead. The crime that occurred in those few minutes is now reconstructed with chilling precision. But for those in the neighborhood, it was the beginning of something beyond comprehension. Sophia had planned to expose Mark's criminal activities. The financial fraud, the embezzlement, these were just the start. She had made her decision. She was no longer afraid of his threats. She was ready to take action. And for a man like Mark, this was the final straw. His calm exterior shattered in an instant, revealing a darker side, one no one had seen before. Mark didn't hesitate. Driven by fear and rage, he acted quickly. The method of murder was not one of impulsivity. It was calculated, cold. He strangled her, a direct and intimate method of silencing the woman who had threatened his carefully constructed life. With his hands, Mark took her life, his anger and desperation overriding whatever fragments of humanity were left in him. There was no struggle, no real chance for Sophia to escape. She had fought briefly, her hands leaving traces of her attempt to claw free, but Mark's strength, fueled by panic and rage, overpowered her. Her final breaths were suffocated in the cold, dark silence of their home. Mark took a moment to compose himself before turning his attention to what would come next. He couldn't afford to leave any evidence behind. He had to dispose of her body completely. What happened in the hours following Sophia's death is more horrific than anything the family could have imagined. Mark carefully wrapped her body in a heavy blanket, as if she were nothing more than an inanimate object to him. Then, he began the gruesome process of dismembering her. He used tools from the garage, items typically associated with everyday tasks, tools that, in this case, became instruments of unimaginable horror. But dismembering her was not enough. Mark was desperate. He had to make sure no trace of Sophia would ever lead back to him. He was not only disposing of a body, he was destroying the last shred of evidence that could bring him down. He cooked her remains. Mark, in a twisted and methodical way, prepared the pieces of his wife's body, seasoned them, and served them. What was meant to be an act of protection turned into an act of pure depravity. He invited their family over the next evening, a seemingly normal family gathering, offering what they thought would be a delicious meal. The family, unaware of the unspeakable horror, ate dinner as usual, unsuspecting that they had just consumed the remains of their beloved mother, wife, and sister. The shock of the truth would come much later. But the most disturbing part of this story wasn't her death. It was what happened next. The family had no idea what they had just eaten, and the investigation was just beginning. As authorities began to uncover the truth, one chilling question remained. Could Mark keep his secret hidden, or would the horrifying reality of his actions finally come to light? Sophia Carter's disappearance was reported the following morning when her friends began to grow concerned. They had received no response to texts or phone calls, which, as they knew, was highly unusual for someone as responsible and family-oriented as Sophia. As the hours passed with no word, a sense of dread began to settle in among her friends, family, and colleagues. By the afternoon, her closest friend, worried sick, called the authorities to file a missing persons report. The investigation into Sophia's disappearance officially began. Mark Carter, her husband, was the first to contact the police. His call to 911 was carefully crafted, filled with feigned distress. "My wife is missing," he said, his voice quivering with what seemed to be genuine concern. "She went out last night, and I haven't heard from her. I don't know where she could be. Please, I need your help." From the very beginning, Mark's demeanor seemed off to the detectives. He presented himself as a man in distress, but there was something mechanical in his responses. No tears, no visible panic, just a calm that felt out of place in such a harrowing situation. Still, the detectives didn't suspect foul play at first. Missing persons cases were not uncommon, and at that point, there was no clear evidence to suggest a crime had been committed. But the cracks in Mark's alibi began to form quickly. As investigators delved deeper into his movements the night of Sophia's disappearance, questions arose. Mark had claimed that after Sophia left for her evening out with friends, he stayed home, working late in his office. Yet, when they checked his phone records, they found that Mark had made several calls and sent texts to unknown numbers, texts that didn't seem to correspond to any legitimate business or personal affairs. His story was beginning to unravel. It was the discovery of blood traces in the Carter home that changed the course of the investigation. The forensic team, carefully combing through the house, found blood splatters in several rooms, including the master bedroom and the hallway leading to the garage. The blood matched Sophia's DNA. It was clear now that something had happened within those walls, something far darker than a simple disappearance. Investigators also uncovered other unsettling evidence, signs of a violent struggle in the living room and the garage. Mark had tried to clean up the mess, but the evidence was undeniable. The forensic team also discovered traces of chemicals used to break down organic material in the garage, a detail that would later prove to be a key clue in the investigation. Witness statements from neighbors further added to the growing suspicion surrounding Mark. One neighbor recalled seeing him leave the house around midnight, his face pale, almost haunted. Another reported hearing a loud thud around 10:45 p.m., followed by complete silence. But it wasn't until the police reviewed the CCTV footage from the front door that the most damning evidence surfaced. They saw Mark entering the house alone after Sophia's arrival. His behavior on the footage was normal, but his demeanor when leaving seemed strange. He was calm, too calm for someone whose wife had just disappeared. As investigators pieced the evidence together, it became increasingly clear that Mark was hiding something. They began to question his involvement more directly, suspecting that his calm exterior was a facade designed to mask his guilt. It was only a matter of time before the detectives gathered enough evidence to bring Mark in for questioning. On a chilly morning in late October, Mark was arrested at his office, surrounded by a team of detectives. The charge was murder. Mark's reaction was not what they had expected. When they cuffed him, he remained eerily silent, his expression unreadable. When asked if he knew why he was being arrested, he simply nodded, but said nothing. His body language was stiff, almost as if he had been preparing for this moment all along. As he sat in the interrogation room, the detectives pressed him for answers. They confronted him with the mounting evidence: the blood, the witness statements, the forensic evidence, and the damning CCTV footage. Still, Mark denied any involvement in his wife's death. He maintained his innocence, repeating that he loved Sophia and would never harm her. But the cracks in his story were too wide to ignore. His alibi was falling apart, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Finally, after hours of intense questioning, Mark cracked. He confessed to the crime, though his confession was chilling in its lack of emotion. He explained how the argument had escalated, how he had strangled Sophia in a fit of rage, and how he had meticulously covered up his crime. But it wasn't just the murder that shocked the detectives. It was the grisly details of what Mark did next. He confessed to dismembering Sophia's body and cooking her remains to destroy the evidence. It was a calculated, premeditated act of depravity. The trial was a media frenzy. Mark Carter, once the respected lawyer and husband, stood accused of a crime so horrific that it stunned the entire city. The prosecution presented the evidence in a clear and methodical manner: the blood, the witness testimony, and most damning of all, the confession. Mark's defense team attempted to argue that he had acted in the heat of the moment, driven by fear and the threat of losing everything. But it was clear to everyone involved that this was not a crime of passion. It was cold, calculated, and brutal. The victim's family was forced to relive the horror of Sophia's death in the courtroom. Her parents, siblings, and friends testified, their voices breaking with grief as they spoke about the woman they had lost. They had never imagined that the man they had once welcomed into their family would become the monster that took Sophia's life. They had been blindsided by his lies, his charm, and his ability to manipulate everyone around him. In the end, Mark Carter was convicted of first-degree murder and desecration of a corpse. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was filled with the cries of Sophia's family, a bittersweet victory in the face of unimaginable loss. For Sophia's family, justice had been served, but it came at a heavy price. Her parents, devastated by the loss of their daughter, had to reconcile the image of a loving husband with the monster who had killed her. Her children, though too young to fully understand, would grow up without their mother, forever haunted by the knowledge of what had been taken from them. Sophia's family spoke out in the aftermath of the trial, urging the public to remember her for the strong, loving woman she had been, not just the victim of a tragic crime. They advocated for more awareness around domestic violence and the dark side of seemingly perfect marriages. Despite the conviction, they knew that no sentence could bring Sophia back. The damage was done, and their lives would never be the same. As they left the courthouse that day, one of her family members whispered, "This won't bring her back. But at least we know the truth now." That's the only thing we can hold on to. The murder of Sophia Carter shocked not only her family and friends, but also the entire community and the world. What began as a tragic disappearance quickly spiraled into one of the most gruesome and unsettling cases the city had ever seen. A woman who had been a respected professional, a loving wife, and a dedicated mother was brutally murdered by the man who had vowed to love and protect her. The details of the crime were so horrific that they left a mark on everyone who learned about it, from the police officers who had to sift through the disturbing evidence to the jurors who had to hear the confession in court. No one could escape the reality of what Mark Carter had done, and the world would never look at their seemingly perfect marriages in quite the same way again. For Sophia's family, the pain of losing her was incomprehensible. Her parents, devastated by the betrayal and loss of their daughter, have spent years grappling with the fact that the person they had once welcomed into their home as family was capable of such a heinous act. Her children, still young when the tragedy occurred, have had to grow up with a void that will never be filled. The trauma of knowing their mother's final moments were spent in fear at the hands of the man they once trusted is a burden they will carry for the rest of their lives. Psychological experts who have examined this case suggest that Mark's behavior was not just a crime of passion, it was the act of someone deeply manipulative and capable of cold calculation. Experts say that such killers often exhibit what they call emotional detachment, the ability to sever ties with any empathy or moral compass in order to achieve their own desires. Mark's charm and normalcy were masks, carefully crafted to hide the dark truth beneath. But when his secrets were threatened, his carefully constructed facade shattered, revealing the monstrous extent of his desperation. Crimes like this are often the result of multiple factors: fear, greed, and the desire for control. But what stands out in Mark's case is the profound sense of entitlement he felt over Sophia's life, and the belief that he could cover up such a crime without consequence. His ability to lie, manipulate, and ultimately deceive everyone around him speaks to the chilling capacity some individuals have to compartmentalize their own morality. Sophia's death has left a legacy that goes beyond the walls of her home. It has forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths about the people they know and trust. How well do we truly know those closest to us? What are the signs of danger we might miss when we are blinded by love or by the image of a perfect marriage? The answers to these questions are complex, but Sophia's case has sparked much-needed conversations about the darker side of human nature and the lengths some people will go to protect their own secrets. As we reflect on the tragic loss of Sophia Carter, we're left with the question, could this tragedy have been prevented? Were there warning signs that could have saved Sophia from the horrific fate that befell her? Looking back, it's easy to ask what went wrong, but the truth is that there's no simple answer. Do you think there were warning signs that could have saved Sophia? Did she miss subtle clues about Mark's behavior that might have alerted her to the danger she was in? Or was the betrayal so deep, so calculated, that even the most watchful eye could not have seen it coming? We want to hear your thoughts. Share your opinions in the comments below. Let's discuss the case together. If you've been captivated by this shocking true crime story and want to hear more deep dives into other unsettling cases, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. We have many more chilling investigations coming your way. Thank you for watching, and remember to keep asking the tough questions. You never know what the truth might reveal.